I've been playing some Grand Theft Auto 4 and Red Dead Redemption again recently, and if there's one thing that has really stood out to me, it's their openings. Of course, I've already spoken at length about Red Dead Redemption's opening 13 minutes, and why I think it's nearly perfect. So now it's GTA 4's turn. What it does right, what it does wrong, and whether or not it still holds up today. So, let's talk about the first 40 minutes of Grand Theft Auto 4.
Daddy's back, you bitches!
First things first, it wouldn't be a Grand Theft Auto game without some comedy, and GTA 4 does not hesitate.
Daddy's back, you bitches!
Because of course, when this game came out, it had been 3.5 years since the last mainline GTA game. Daddy was most certainly back. This is a surprisingly comedic way to open the game that is largely considered the darkest in the series, but it makes sense. Just because it's comedic doesn't mean it's light. In the game's first shot, we see Niko deep in the belly of a dirty ship, surrounded by grime and rust, uneven architecture, and weak dim lights. Even his clothes look dark and bland. And despite the beautiful sweeping shot of Liberty City and Happiness Island in the background, the foreground and focus of the scene is still on the dirty boat, the discreet drug dealing, the messy kitchen with its illegal activities, and at the end of all that, we're left on a dark and dingy dock deep in the run-down industrial corner of Broker. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Let's talk about those sweeping shots. What a way to introduce the next generation of Grand Theft Auto. Previous games in the series, while still impressive in their own way, were restricted to an almost comic book-like style of opening, with smaller, more focused clips accompanied by static credits text. With the improved technology then, what better way to introduce the high-definition era than with sweeping shots accompanied by moving, layered credits? Also interestingly and notably comparable to previous games is the scale of this introduction. Despite being rather self-contained, only using one location rather than several like its predecessors, it somehow feels more epic. The use of these sweeping shots, the interesting text placement, and the growth of the music, it all adds to the cinematic feeling of the opening, and is a remarkable introduction to the first truly cinematic game by Rockstar. I mean, just watch this scene.
We all do dumb things. That's what makes us human.
Could be.
Although it might not be immediately obvious, these opening scenes introduce several different storylines that are integral to the game and its episodic expansions. First up is the heroin, which is seen being smuggled off the boat by the Triads. We'll later see the drugs swap hands several times over the course of this game and The Lost and Damned, and it becomes pretty important around the finale of GTA 4 itself, before it's finally resolved towards the end of the Ballad of Gay Tony. Similarly, we also see the introduction of the diamonds, hidden in a batch of cake mix to smuggle into the city. These are probably the most significant through line in the trilogy, connecting all three protagonists at different times and not truly being resolved until the final cutscene of the final game in the trilogy. Another slightly more subtle but no less important storyline introduced is the concept of the American dream.
Like they say, it is the land of opportunity. I always wanted to make it big. Own a nice place, get a dog, a house, live the dream.
Of course, the thing about dreams is that most of them are lies. It doesn't take long for this to become apparent in the game, and Niko and his cousin Roman will spend a lot of their time seeking this set of ideals throughout the game. And of course, throughout this opening cutscene, we get several snippets of information regarding Niko's past. We discover that he got into trouble, that he was involved in a war, and that after the war,
I did some dumb things, got involved with some idiots.
It takes some time for Niko to actually open up about it, but a significant part of this game's story, especially the back half, deals with his past and the reason why he has come to America at this time. Teasing that plotline this early on is a great way to keep the player engaged in the story and character. Of course, it doesn't take too long for the game to introduce its second most important character, Niko's cousin Roman, though perhaps it takes longer than Niko would like because, of course, Roman is late, and drunk, and continuing to lie even though Niko is minutes away from discovering the truth anyway.
Let's go. To the mansion, huh?
Yes, the mansion!
This is an interesting way to set up such a major character. You're initially somewhat drawn to him because of his ill-mannered sense of humour, promises of luxury, and of course his relationship to Niko. But as you arrive at the apartment, you soon realise that he has been lying to Niko for years, that his story of mansions and sports cars were all deceitful. As the player, although it's only been a few minutes in real time, you'll likely, and rightfully, feel annoyed and betrayed. But of course, Roman justifies himself.
All I needed was one good guy. One good guy I could do well. Not take over the world, but do okay. Now maybe I have this.
You got me, Roman. I am a good guy. He's a lovable idiot, and the game does a great job of demonstrating this straight away. His actions are harmless, at least to everyone but himself, and truthfully, he just needs help navigating his problems. Perhaps the player, as Nico, can help him do so. Speaking of navigating, another thing that this opening gets right is that it immediately puts the player in the driver's seat. You're going to spend a decent portion of this game behind the wheel, so making this the very first thing you're tasked with doing in the story is a smart move by Rockstar, and an effective opening tutorial. And say what you will about them, and maybe this is just nostalgia talking, but I really like the driving physics in this game. I think they're great. Though I wish the character's dialogue would only last as long as the drive, so I didn't have to drive at a snail's pace just to hear it all. That opening drive does a great job of introducing even more of the story too. An explanation for the closed bridges, the existence and location of Roman's cab company, some basic demographics of the Hove Beach area, and unsurprisingly, more of Roman's stories.
You ever had two women at once?
And finally, of course, this opening mission introduces the player to safe houses, sleeping and saving, the head-up display and map, parking spaces, and fast food vendors. Even GPS paths for waypoints, which is a new feature to the series. The basic stuff. A game like GTA 4 though has several more mechanics and features yet to be introduced, and it does so over the next few missions. This is pretty standard for most games, and Rockstar is usually pretty good at it. I've been over this, but I think Red Dead Redemption sets a pretty high standard for it, even after the mission that I discussed in my last video, and Red Dead Redemption 2 meets that bar with its vast addition of even more mechanics. Even GTA 4 does a pretty good job with it, but in the game's second mission, it almost didn't. Thankfully, the introduction of the actual characters and gameplay features is effective. We get to meet Vlad and Mallory, two of the game's more important and entertaining characters, in a fairly entertaining scene.
Tell this fucking yokel here, if he doesn't stop staring at me, I'll have his head chopped off and put a film of it on the internet!
We're also introduced to the in-game mobile phone, and shown the basic concept of enemies and how they appear on the radar. All of this is fine, and it's great to do this so early without cramming it all into the busy first mission. But all you do in this second mission is drive to a marker, wait there for over a minute doing absolutely nothing, and then drive back. This is not a great way to get players invested in the story, and while they sit in the car looking in circles for over a minute, they'll probably use that time wondering if the developers have somehow already run out of ideas. But of course, they most certainly haven't run out of ideas. They just need to introduce us to a few more mechanics before they can get to the good ones. The third mission is a simple one with a simple gameplay objective. Drive to a location, pick people up, drive somewhere else, drop them off. But it uses this simple gameplay to advance the narrative a significant amount. We get to meet Roman's loan sharks, we finally see a quick display of Nico's true strength, we get properly introduced to the car's radio stations, and we meet Michelle, Nico's first girlfriend in the game. And at the end of the mission, we're introduced to clothing stores, a non-essential but interesting feature of the game. It's a simple and unremarkable mission that does little in the way of gameplay tutorial, but introduces several narrative points that will soon be relevant. Now the next mission is where things really get interesting, or rather the next missions. This is the first time in which the player gets to choose which mission to play next, and the way it is introduced is fascinating. While driving to Michelle's place to initiate a date, Nico gets a panicked call from Roman, who says that he is in trouble. Now the game doesn't actually present it as such, but this is actually the first decision that the player gets to make in the game, a mechanic that is new to the series but is ultimately integral to the main storyline of GTA 4. If the player chooses to turn around and help Roman, Nico will later apologize to Michelle when they ultimately go for their date. If he ignores his cousin's pleas and goes for the date, then afterwards he will need to pick Roman up from the hospital and save him later when he gets beaten up for a second time. This certainly isn't the first time you get to choose which mission to start next. That's basically a staple of Rockstar's open world games. But, at least to my knowledge, this is the first time that making that decision actually has consequences. Mind you, they're not exactly long-term consequences. Your relationship with both Michelle and Roman goes unchanged regardless of your decision. But it's a great precursor to the much larger decisions that take place later in the game, and the seamless and intuitive implementation of the decision is highly commendable. The missions themselves are pretty great too. Michelle's mission introduces the player to dating, friendships, and bowling, while continuing to advance the narrative and drop hints at events that will transpire later. It's a fun mission too, and pretty iconic if, like me, you've started this game over again more times than you can count. Roman's mission, meanwhile, finally introduces the player to hand-to-hand combat, chasing sequences, and the oft-forgotten mechanic of disarming enemies. It also advances the narrative by taking out most of Roman's loan sharks, and, at least in one version of the dialogue, we see more of Nico's despair as he breaks his promise not to kill anyone.
Ah! I promised myself I wouldn't kill people here!
We also hear the first mention of Ray Bulgarin, who will become much more important later in the game, and especially in the Ballad of Gay Tony.
Bulgarin. He lived on the Adriatic. Believed I owed him money when I did not. It made my life impossible.
Of course, there wouldn't be much of an open-world Rockstar game if there wasn't still more tutorial to complete, but GTA 4 does a pretty good job. In the next 2 missions for Roman, you're introduced to wanted levels, pay and spray, the new cover system, firearms, shooting, and Roman's cab driving jobs, all while advancing the narrative bit by bit and slowly revealing more of Nico's story.
I'm looking for something.
In its opening 40 minutes, Grand Theft Auto 4 does an effective job of introducing and advancing the narrative and demonstrating its basic gameplay mechanics, all while continuing to keep the player engaged. It's not perfect, the second mission is a good example of what not to do to keep the player entertained. But considering that this was a step in a new direction for Rockstar, their efforts are highly commendable. And ultimately, the game benefits overall. GTA 4 is one of my favourite games in the series, possibly my number 1, and among the greatest games I've ever played. Its story is so entertaining and emotional, and to me, the gameplay still holds up to this day. But one of the main reasons I'm so willing to replay this game after all this time is because of its opening. Even before it's given you a gun or side missions to complete, the game is enjoyable to play. Even though I already know how all the game mechanics work from my many previous playthroughs, I still don't mind sitting through most of the tutorial missions before getting to the actual meat of the story. It's not perfect in every way, but GTA 4 sets a great bar that Rockstar would continue to follow up on, and surpass, in every game to come. After all this time, Grand Theft Auto 4 and its opening are still among the very best that gaming has to offer.